"It'll be just a few weeks." That's what they said. The sentence hung in the air of the hallway, thin and brittle, like it might shatter if I breathed on it too hard. My mother's hands were steady as she zipped up the side pocket of my suitcase, a faded purple thing I'd had since I was 7. She didn't look at me. Her focus was entirely on the teeth of the zipper, making sure they lined up perfectly, as if that small act of order could contain the chaos that was suddenly swirling around us. My father stood by the door, his hand on the knob, his gaze fixed on something over my shoulder. The silence in that hallway was louder than any argument I'd ever heard. Then the door clicked shut behind me, the sound echoing with a finality that my 10-year-old mind couldn't quite process. I stood on the porch, the weight of the suitcase pulling on my arm, and watched as their car pulled away from the curb. The red taillights were like 2 angry eyes staring back at me, growing smaller and smaller until they were just pinpricks in the deepening twilight. Then they blinked out as the car turned the corner at the end of the street. If someone you love says just a bit, do you trust them or do you brace for the worst? I trusted them. I went inside my aunt's house and I waited for the phone to ring. I waited for them to tell me it was time to come home. The car turned the corner, the taillights disappeared, and the phone never rang. And the biggest question wasn't where they had gone, it was why they didn't call. The day I left, I was wearing my favorite shirt. It was a soft, worn-in cotton, the color of a summer sky just before sunset, with a cartoon fox curled up on the front. I remember tracing the outline of the fox with my mom while my mom packed my things. She was methodical, efficient. A stack of t-shirts, 3 pairs of jeans, socks rolled into neat little balls. It didn't look like a bag for a vacation. It looked like an inventory list. My mother, Catherine, was always even-keeled. Her emotions were kept on a high shelf, out of reach. She spoke in calm, measured tones, even now. "We just need some time to sort things out," she explained, folding a sweater. The words felt rehearsed, scrubbed clean of any real meaning. My father, David, was quieter. He was a man made of polite nods and brief, non-committal answers. He stood in the doorway of my room, watching, but not really seeing. He just looked tired, like he'd been running a race for miles and had forgotten why he'd even started. Aunt Marge was my mom's sister. She lived 3 towns over, a drive that felt like crossing into another country. Her house smelled of lemon polish and something else I couldn't place, something vaguely sad, like old flowers. She greeted me at the door with a hug that felt more like a formality than an embrace. "You'll be in the guest ring, sweetie," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. But I knew I wasn't home. Home was on Oakwood Drive, in a small blue house with a squeaky front step and a crooked mailbox. Home was my room, with its glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling. This was just a place with a bed. The first few days were a blur of newness. The strange shape of the trees outside the window, the unfamiliar chime of the grandfather clock in the hall, the way the water from the tap tasted differently. I met the neighbor kid Lenny. He had a shock of red hair and a galaxy of freckles across his face. He didn't ask questions. He just showed me the best place to catch frogs in the creek behind his house and taught me how to skip stones that bounced 7 times before they sank. He became my first and, for a long time, only friend in this new world. The initial story was simple. My parents needed space, a financial hiccup, a rough patch they had to navigate without a child underfoot. It was an adult problem, and I was told not to worry. But worry is a weed. It grows in the dark. At school, the questions started. My new teacher, Mrs. Gable, would ask with a concerned tilt of her head, "And how are your parents settling in?" I'd mumble something about them being busy with the move. The other kids were less subtle. They'd whisper in the hallways, "She lives with her aunt. Where are her real parents?" The words were like tiny stones hitting glass, not big enough to break it, but leaving 1,000 little marks. I would sit in class, staring out the window, imagining their car pulling up to the school. I'd picture my mom walking into the office to sign me out, telling me the sorting out was done. Every day I held on to that image. It was a life raft. Would you wait, or would you run back? I waited. Every afternoon, I'd walk back to Aunt Marge's house, and the first thing I'd do was check the mailbox. I'd pull open the little metal door, my heart thumping, hoping to see a letter, a postcard, anything with my mother's elegant handwriting on it. The first week passed. The mailbox was always empty. Life at Aunt Marge's house was governed by a set of unwritten rules that I learned through trial and error. Dinner was at 6 o'clock sharp, shoes were to be left by the door, always. The television was turned off at 9. It wasn't a cruel place, just orderly. I felt less like her niece and more like a long-term guest, a line item she had to manage. My aunt was kind in a distant way. She made sure I had food, that my clothes were clean, that my homework was done. But there was a wall between us, a polite and well-maintained fence that I didn't know how to climb. At night, the loneliness was a physical weight. I'd bury my face in a pillow that didn't smell like my own and cry until my eyes were sore. The tears were silent, a secret I kept from the quiet house. I tried calling them. I'd sneak out to the phone in the kitchen after Aunt Marge went to bed, my bare feet cold on the linoleum. I'd dial the number I knew by heart, the number to our little blue house. It would ring, and then the click of the machine. "You've reached the Davidsons. We can't come to the phone right now." My mother's voice, cheerful and recorded, felt like a ghost. I'd leave frantic, whispered messages. "Mom, Dad, it's me. When are you coming? I miss you." The machine would beep, signaling the end of my allotted time, and I'd hang up, the silence rushing back in to fill the space. About a month into my stay, the first real crack appeared in the story I was holding on to. We were in the kitchen. I was doing my homework at the table, and Aunt Marge was washing dishes, her back to me. I had asked for the 100th time if she'd heard from them. She sighed, a small, tired sound. She stopped scrubbing a plate and stared out the window above the sink. "They signed something, you know," she said, her voice quiet, almost an afterthought. The words dropped into the air like a stone into a still pond. "Signed something? What did that mean?" I asked her, my voice trembling a little. She turned, her expression unreadable. "It's complicated, honey. Paperwork. For you to stay here, just for a while." But her tone didn't say, "just for a while." It said something else, something heavier, something more permanent. The idea of paperwork felt cold and official. It felt like a lock clicking into place. If someone tells you paperwork exists, do you believe them or do you ask for proof? That night, I couldn't sleep. The word paperwork echoed in my head. Adults used paperwork to make things final. I knew that much. I waited until I heard the soft click of her bedroom door closing, until the grandfather clock had chimed midnight. Then I slipped out of my room and crept down the hallway to the small office where she kept her files. My hands were shaking as I gently pulled open the top drawer of her desk. It was full of folders, bills, old greeting cards. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I would recognize it. Tucked in the back, under a stack of bank statements, was a thick manila envelope. My name was written on the front in my mother's handwriting. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled out the papers inside. It was a jumble of legal jargon I didn't understand, but at the bottom of the last page, there were lines for signatures. My aunt's name was there, neat and clear. Below it was another line, and on that line, I saw it. The elegant, familiar loop of my mother's K, the start of her name. But the rest of the signature had been torn away. The page was ripped right through the middle of her name, a jagged, violent line. Just half a signature, hovering over a document that sealed my fate. The weeks bled into months, and the months stitched themselves into a year. The world kept turning, but I felt like I was standing still, waiting for a train that was never going to arrive. My 11th birthday came and went. I spent the day with Aunt Marge and Lenny. We had a small cake with vanilla frosting. I blew out the candles and wished for the sound of my parents' car in the driveway. The wish dissolved into the air with the smoke. There was no card in the mail, no call. The silence was the only gift I received. At school, I was in the spring recital. I had a small part in the chorus, standing in the back row wearing a scratchy, homemade costume. I scanned the audience, a sea of smiling, proud faces, searching for two that weren't there. I sang my heart out, hoping my voice could somehow travel across the towns and through the phone lines, a signal to let them know I was still here. I was still waiting. My attempts to reach them grew more desperate. I sent letters to our old address, filled with drawings and questions. Are you okay? When can I come home? Do you miss me? I never knew if they were ever delivered. They were just messages in a bottle, tossed into an ocean of uncertainty. The emotional contrast was stark. I watched Lenny's parents cheer him on at his baseball games. I saw my classmates get picked up from school by their mothers, their fathers. I saw casual hugs, inside jokes, the easy comfort of belonging. For me, life was a series of polite transactions with Aunt Marge. She was a good guardian, a responsible caretaker, but the warmth of family was missing. It was like living in a perfectly maintained house where the furnace was broken. The second turning point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was home from school early with a cold. I was supposed to be in my room resting, but I'd crept out to get a glass of water. Aunt Marge was on the phone in the kitchen, her back to me, her voice low. I froze in the hallway, hidden by the shadows. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, only her hushed, strained replies. "I know it's hard," she was saying, but we had to do what was best for her. There was no other choice. A pause. I held my breath. Then she whispered a single phrase, so quiet I almost missed it. We couldn't let social services get involved. Social services. The words were a bucket of ice water. That wasn't about a rough patch. That wasn't about sorting things out. That was about something serious, something broken. If adults say they acted for your own good, should you assume they were right? Up until that moment, I had believed, on some level, that this was about protecting me. But that phrase, social services, suggested they were protecting themselves. It planted a seed of doubt that would grow into a forest of suspicion over the next decade. That night, my unease wouldn't let me rest. I felt like a detective in my own life, searching for clues that everyone else was trying to hide. Aunt Marge had an old cedar chest at the foot of her bed where she kept blankets and old photo albums. I'd never been allowed to look through it. She called it her memory box. While she was out grocery shopping the next day, I lifted the heavy lid. The smell of cedar and mothballs filled the air. Beneath layers of quilts, I found the albums. I flipped through pages of faded photographs, my mom and her as kids, family vacations, holidays. And then I found it, a loose picture tucked into the back of an album. It was from a Christmas, maybe a year or two before I left. My parents were standing by a fireplace, smiling. My father had his arm around my mother. But they weren't alone. Standing next to my father was another man, his hand clapped on my dad's shoulder. He was tall, with cold eyes, and a smile that didn't look like a smile at all. It was my grandfather. The official story, the one I'd been told my whole life, was that my grandfather had passed away years ago, long before I was born. But here he was, solid and real, in a picture taken while I was alive. And the look on my parents' faces wasn't just a holiday smile. It was strained. It was terrified. The story I had been told was a lie, and this faded photograph was the first piece of proof. The years passed. 10 became 13, 13 became 16. My childhood confusion curdled into a hard, protective shell of teenage anger. I was a ghost in my own life, haunting the hallways of a high school where I didn't quite fit in. My grades were average, my attitude was sullen. I was an expert at being invisible. I found my tribe in the other kids who lived on the margins, a couple of friends who understood what it was like to feel untethered. They became my family. They didn't ask about the parents I never mentioned. They just accepted the empty space, the silence. and filled it with late-night conversations, shared headphones, and the fierce, unspoken loyalty of outcasts. The emotional cost of my exile was high. I never went to sleepovers. The thought of a curious parent asking, "So, what do your mom and dad do?" was enough to make my stomach clench. I built walls around myself, high and thick. Trust was a foreign currency I didn't know how to spend. The hunger for answers never really went away, though. It just went dormant, a sleeping dragon in my chest. When I was 17, I finally got my driver's license. The first thing I did was save up enough money for a tank of gas. One Saturday morning, I told Aunt Marge I was going to the library to study. Instead, I drove the 45 miles back to Oakwood Drive. My hands were slick on the steering wheel, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I drove down my old street. The houses looked smaller, the trees bigger. It was familiar and alien all at once. And then I saw it, the little blue house. But it wasn't blue anymore. It was a dull, sterile beige. A different car was in the driveway. A family I didn't know was having a barbecue in the backyard. I parked across the street and just stared, the engine idling. I watched a little boy who looked to be about 6 chase a ball across the lawn I used to call my own. After what felt like an eternity, I got out of the car and walked up the cracked pavement of the front walk. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorbell. Before I could press it, the front door opened. A woman I'd never seen before looked at me, a question in her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. I couldn't speak. The words were stuck in my throat. I just stood there. Then an older woman came out from the house next door. It was Mrs. Henderson, who used to give me cookies when I was little. She recognized me. Her face was a mixture of shock and pity. "My goodness," she whispered, "is that you?" The woman who now lived in my house looked confused. Mrs. Henderson gently took my arm and led me away from the door. "Honey," she said, her voice soft, "they're not here. They moved away a long time ago." I asked when. She looked at the ground, then back at me. "Not long after you went to stay with your aunt, maybe a few months." They hadn't just sent me away, they had left too. They had erased our entire life in that town. Would you confront them, or would you collect proof first? I had nothing to confront. They were gone. As I turned to walk back to my car, defeated, Miss Henderson added one more thing, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There was a big fight, you know, the week before you left. Your grandfather was here, yelling. I heard it all the way from my kitchen." The sleeping dragon in my chest stirred. A name, a scene, another piece of the puzzle, sharp and painful. The puzzle pieces floated in my mind for years, a jumble of disconnected facts. The torn signature, the whispered mention of social services, the photograph of a grandfather who was supposed to be dead, the neighbor's story of a fight. I graduated high school, went to a local community college, and worked part-time at a bookstore. I built a life, a small and quiet one, on the foundation of not knowing. The full truth came not from a confrontation, but from a cardboard box. Aunt Marge passed away when I was 22. It was peaceful, in her sleep. After the funeral, it was up to me to clear out her house, the house I had grown up in but had never truly called home. I spent weeks sorting through her life, a quiet archaeology of a woman I had lived with but barely known. In the back of her closet, tucked under a pile of old blankets, was a small, sealed box with my name on it. My hands trembled as I sliced open the tape. Inside was not a collection of childhood memorabilia, but a stack of letters. Letters from my mother to Aunt Marge, written over the course of 12 years. I sat on the floor of that dusty closet and read my life story, told in a voice I hadn't heard in over a decade. The letters revealed the central, horrifying twist. It wasn't just about money or a marital dispute. It was about my grandfather. He wasn't dead. He was a wealthy, powerful, and deeply abusive man who had controlled my parents' lives through money and fear. The rough patch they were going through was a desperate attempt to untangle themselves from his financial and emotional grip. He hadn't liked the way they were raising me, Too soft, too independent, he saw me as a tool, another pawn to control them. The big fight Mrs. Henderson had heard was the breaking point. He had threatened them. He had said that if they didn't fall in line, he would find a way to get custody of me himself. He told them he would straighten me out, and my mother wrote that the look in his eyes when he said it was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. He was a monster hiding in plain sight, and they were trapped. Sending me away to Aunt Marge's was a panicked, last-ditch effort to get me out of his reach. It was meant to be temporary, a few weeks for them to find a lawyer, to figure out a way to disappear from him for good. The torn signature on the guardianship papers was from my mother's shaking hand, her uncertainty ripped onto the page. But my grandfather was relentless. He had resources, investigators. My parents had to go deeper underground, changing their names, moving from city to city, always looking over their shoulders. They cut off all contact not because they didn't love me, but because they were terrified that any link to me would lead him right to my door. The few weeks were a lie they told to protect me, a lie that stretched and hardened into a 12-year exile. Does the end justify the means when children pay the price? I read about their fear, their guilt, their hollow existence on the run. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a reason that was so much more complex and painful than simple abandonment. Tucked at the bottom of the box was a small, unlabeled cassette tape. I found an old Walkman in a drawer and pressed play. It was a voicemail, the recording tinny and warped with age. It was my mother's voice, raw with a panic I'd never heard before. "Marge, it's me. He found out where she is. He knows the town. Tell her not to answer the door. Tell her, oh God, tell her not to come home. Don't let her come home." The message was dated 3 years into my stay. She wasn't forgetting me. She was actively, desperately pushing me away to keep me alive. The truth didn't bring peace. It brought a storm. I sat in that empty house for days, surrounded by the ghosts of 2 different lives, unable to reconcile the parents who abandoned me with the parents who saved me. The anger I had nurtured for 12 years felt directionless. Who was I supposed to be angry at? Them for their cowardice and their lies? My grandfather for being the monster that set it all in motion? Myself for not understanding? There were no easy answers. The letters gave me a story, but they didn't give me a home. I finished clearing out the house, sold it, and used the small inheritance from my aunt to start over for real. I moved to a new city, a place where no one knew my name or my fractured history. I got a job as a graphic designer, a profession where I could create order and beauty out of blank space. I rented a small apartment with a fire escape that overlooked a bustling street. It was mine. Every book on the shelf, every cup in the cupboard was chosen by me. I earned my diploma online, late at night after work. I framed it and hung it on my wall. It wasn't from a prestigious university, but it was a testament to my resilience. It was proof that I could build something from nothing. I was not just a victim. I was a survivor. For years, I lived quietly with the knowledge, letting it settle. I didn't try to find them. The letters had said they had to stay hidden. I didn't want to be the one to put them in danger again. But the past has a way of finding you. A clue appeared, not in a dramatic reveal, but in the quiet glow of a computer screen. I was scrolling through a social media site, looking at photos from a distant cousin's wedding. And there, in the background of a candid shot, I saw him, my father. He looked older, grayer, the lines around his eyes deeper, but it was him. He was standing next to a woman who must have been my mother. They were in the background, blurry and out of focus, but undeniably there. My breath caught in my chest. The caption on the photo tagged the location, a vineyard just a few hours' drive from my city. A quick search of public records confirmed it. My grandfather had passed away 2 years ago, a heart attack. The monster was gone. They were free, and they were close. The knowledge sat like a stone in my gut. They were back. They were living their lives, maybe even under their real names again. And they hadn't come for me. The threat was gone, but they still hadn't come. When you find the person who hurt you, do you demand answers or do you demand distance? For days, I wrestled with that question. Part of me wanted to slam the door on the past for good, to continue building my life without them. But another part, the 10-year-old girl still waiting by the phone, needed to look them in the eye. With a trembling hand, I went online and bought a bus ticket. The bus ride was a 3-hour journey through my own past. With every mile, memories I had buried came rushing back. The smell of my mother's perfume, the sound of my father's quiet laugh, the feeling of being small and safe between them. By the time I arrived in their new town, I was a wreck of nerves and resolve. I found their address easily. It was a small, unassuming house on a quiet suburban street, not unlike the one I had left behind. I walked up the driveway, my heart pounding a rhythm of fear and fury against my ribs. Each step felt heavy, like I was wading through water. I could see them through the front window. They were in the kitchen. My mother was stirring something on the stove. My father was reading the newspaper at the table. It was a scene of such ordinary domesticity, it felt like a punch to the gut. I raised my hand and rang the doorbell. The chime was startlingly loud in the quiet afternoon. I saw my father look up from his paper, a flicker of annoyance on his face. He walked to the door and opened it. And then he saw me. His face went pale. The newspaper slipped his hand and fluttered to the floor. "Hello, Dad," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. My mother came into the hallway, wiping her hands on an apron. "David, who is it?" she asked. Then she saw me, and the wooden spoon she was holding clattered to the floor. We sat in their living room, a space filled with furniture I didn't recognize, and a silence that was suffocating. The air smelled faintly of coffee and bleach. They looked at me, then at each other, then at the floor. The awkwardness was a physical presence in the room. I was a ghost at their table, a past they thought they had outrun. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just started talking. I told them about the empty mailbox, the missed birthdays, the whispers at school. I told them about finding the torn papers, about hearing the words social services, about seeing the photograph. I told them about Aunt Marge's box of letters. As I spoke, my mother began to weep, silent tears streaming down her face. My father just sat there, his expression carved from stone. When I finished, the silence returned, heavier than before. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice thick with a grief that was 12 years old. "We were so scared," she whispered. "He would have hurt you. He would have broken you, just to get back at us. We didn't know what else to do." My father finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, hollowed-out shame. "Every day," he said, his voice cracking. "Every single day, we thought about you. Every day we wondered if we did the right thing." I asked them the one question that still burned inside me. Why didn't you come for me when he was gone? Why did I have to find you in the background of the photograph? My mother broke down completely then, sobbing into her hands. It was my father who answered. He explained that after years on the run, living with fear as their constant companion, they didn't know how to stop. The shame of what they'd done had become its own kind of prison. They were afraid I would hate them, that I had a new life, that showing up would only cause more pain. They were paralyzed by their own guilt. If the person who hurt you says they were scared, does that make it okay? It doesn't make it okay, but it makes it human. As I stood up to leave, my father said one last thing, his voice barely a whisper, a single sentence that was meant to be the ultimate justification, the one that explained everything. "We did it to keep you alive." The words hung in the air between us, a shield and a sword all at once, and they left me completely speechless. I walked away from that house and didn't look back. The confrontation I thought I wanted left me feeling empty and raw. There was no satisfying climax, no cinematic moment of catharsis. There was just the quiet, messy truth. Answers bring pain, but they also bring a strange kind of closure. The not knowing had been a ghost haunting me for years. Now, the ghost had a name and a face, and while it was ugly, at least it was real. For weeks, I felt like I was drifting. The anger that had been my fuel for so long was gone, replaced by a profound and bewildering sadness. I was grieving. But how do you grieve someone who never truly left you, but also never really stayed? You grieve the family you were supposed to have, the childhood that was stolen, the years you can never get back. My friends, my chosen family, rallied around me. They didn't offer easy platitudes. They just sat with me in the silence, brought me food I didn't feel like eating, and let me talk when I needed to, let me be quiet when I didn't. Their presence was a quiet anchor in the storm. A few weeks after the confrontation, a package arrived at my apartment. It was from a law firm. My parents had sent it. Inside was a thick file. It contained copies of my grandfather's legal documents, trust funds, and last will and testament. A letter from my mother explained that he had controlled them through a complex web of legal and financial threats. Their inheritance, their home, everything had been tied up in trusts he manipulated. The documents were dense and confusing, but one thing was clear: he had systematically written me out of everything. But as I sifted through the paperwork, a name I had never seen before kept appearing. It was the name of the executor of his estate, a man who had signed off on every change, every amendment that had tightened my grandfather's control and ensured my exclusion. The man who had forced my parents' hand wasn't just a ghost from the past. He was still out there, managing the fortune built on my family's fear. Seeing that name on paper shifted something in me. This was no longer just a family tragedy. It was a legal and financial conspiracy. The choice wasn't just about my parents anymore. It was about accountability. Did I hold on to the pain, or did I let it go? The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't about choosing one or the other. It was about choosing myself. I started therapy. For the first time, I told the whole story, from beginning to end, to a neutral party. My therapist didn't tell me whether to forgive or to forget. She helped me understand that I could do neither and still move forward. Forgiveness wasn't a gift I owed my parents. Healing was a gift I owed myself. I sat down and drafted a letter. I poured 12 years of anger, confusion, and grief onto the page. I wrote about the lonely nights, the feeling of being a guest in my own life, the shame of not having an answer when people asked where my parents were. I wrote about the moment I saw them through the window, living a normal life while mine had been anything but. It was the most honest thing I had ever written. Then I sealed it in an envelope, addressed it, and put a stamp on it. But I didn't mail it. Not yet. The act of writing it was for me. The act of sending it would be a different choice entirely. My life began to move forward, on my terms. I set boundaries. I changed my phone number. I decided that any future contact would be initiated by me if and when I was ready. I visited Aunt Marge's grave and left flowers. I thanked her, not for being a mother, but for being a safe harbor in the storm, for giving me the quiet, orderly space I needed to survive. I was no longer a child waiting for permission to live. I was an adult who had taken her life back. The question of my parents remained. If it were you, would you forgive, or would you walk away forever? For months, the letter sat on my desk, a white rectangle of unresolved history. Walking away felt like letting the silence win. Forgiving felt like letting them off the hook. But there was a third option. Not forgiveness, but understanding. Not walking away, but moving on. One crisp autumn evening, I made a choice. I drove to a quiet park overlooking the city. I reread the letter one last time. Then I took out a lighter and set the corner of the envelope on fire. I watched as the flames consumed the paper, turning my pain into ash that drifted away on the wind. That was for me. Then I went home and wrote a different letter. This one was short. It contained no accusations, no anger. It simply said, "I know the truth now. I am building my own life. I hope you find peace in yours." I sealed it, and this time I walked to the mailbox and dropped it inside. It wasn't an invitation. It was a conclusion. Years have passed since that day. I am older now. My life is full. It's not the life I would have had if that car hadn't turned the corner 12 years before, but it is a good life. It is a life I built. My family is a patchwork quilt of loyal friends who have seen me at my worst and celebrate me at my best. I keep a small faded photograph in a box on my bookshelf. It's not a reminder of the pain. It's a reminder that stories are always more complicated than they seem, and that survival is its own kind of victory. I've learned how to say no. I've learned that I don't owe anyone an explanation for the boundaries I set to protect my own peace. Reconciliation isn't a neat, happy ending that you see in movies. For me, it's a quiet, ongoing process of accepting the past without letting it own my future. I never heard from them after I sent that final letter, and I didn't expect to. The door between us isn't slammed shut, but it isn't wide open either. It's just a door, and I'm no longer standing in the hallway waiting for it to open. Would you ever let someone back in after 12 years? That's the question people always want to know the answer to. They want a simple yes or no. They want to know if the story ends with a hug or a handshake or a final decisive turn away. But the truth is, some endings aren't endings at all. They're just a quiet space where you finally get to decide what happens next. My hand reaches for a doorknob, and for the first time in a very long time, I pause. I get to choose whether or not I turn it.